You may know that there's a theory of tragedy associated with the philosopher Hegel in the early 19th century, which puts contradiction at the heart of tragedy. Tragedy is about contradiction, but for Hegel it's about the resolution of one-sided contradictions. They collide, and out of it comes something superior. The Antigone is his primary exhibit. Contradiction between the state and the family. That contradiction is at the heart of the Antigone. There's dreadful suffering that results from it, but in the end, you arrive at some kind of resolution of the contradiction and a higher level of society. And Hegel, of course, believed that the state was the embodiment of the absolute spirit, and he spent most of his life engaged in resolving contradiction. I mean, he was born in 1770. He was 19 when the French Revolution started. He remained loyal to the French Revolution throughout his life, but that meant he was constantly facing a big historical contradiction between, on the one hand, the inherited particularities, privileges, rights, practices of the small German states where he had to live, on the other hand, what he could see in the glorious future, which is the universality that arises from the French Revolution and will inform the new modern state. That was precisely the contradiction that he was engaged in and was trying to resolve. And in his attempt to resolve it, he would talk about the one-sidedness of the people who were universalists. They didn't sufficiently recognize the rights of the small states. So his notion of one-sided contradiction is not just part of his theory of tragedy, it's about his profound political engagement. He wrote pamphlets and so on and so forth. Now let's switch to Nietzsche, born in 1844, who is the diametric opposite of Hegel in every respect that I've mentioned. He has a lifelong antipathy to what he calls the state and society, which he regards as merely an obstacle to individualism. After he gives up his job in Basel in 1879, where he was a professor of Greek for a few years, he lives a very solitary life, moving with a suitcase from one place to another, never settling down, never, of course, being politically engaged in any sense, being hostile to it in every sense. Of course, he had no relationship with a woman, though apparently he did visit brothels. And he writes The Birth of Tragedy, first in 1872. And The Birth of Tragedy represents, interestingly, what I call the reification of contradiction. You have some examples of it in handout number 6. That is to say, contradiction is no longer the contradiction of, say, the state and society on the one hand, with the family on the other. It's not a contradiction of anything in particular, it's just contradiction. And incidentally, he says that the state and society is completely excluded from the purely religious origins of tragedy. So he wants to separate tragedy on the one hand as a metaphysical phenomenon from the state and society on the other. This is total nonsense. I mean, nobody would believe this now, but this is, he was quite young when he wrote it. But this is a kind of influential nonsense. And, of course, there is the reification of contradiction means, of course, that it's irresolvable. It's just contradiction. It's what he calls Widerspruch. And you have the passages in front of you on 6, in passage 6. So contradiction is reified as a thing separate from any particularities, and it's abstract, it's primordial, and above all, it's irresolvable. So of course there is a correlation between political disengagement and the taste for irresolvable contradiction, just as there is a correlation between the political engagement of Hegel and his imagining tragedy in terms of resolvable contradiction. In this respect, Hegel is much more like the ancient Athenians than Nietzsche is, of course. And modern academics, particularly in North America, I have to say, are in both these respects, both politically and theoretically, much more like Nietzsche. At that point, I end. Thank you.